Private Zhou Wei stood at the entrance of an American supply warehouse, hands cuffed behind his back, eyes wide with disbelief. The warehouse stretched before him like a cathedral, ceiling 30 feet high, concrete floor polished to a shine. And inside, stacks upon stacks of wooden crates marked with English letters he couldn't read. Canned meat, flour, sugar, coffee, blankets, uniforms, boots, medicine, ammunition, vehicle parts, tires, gasoline drums, all organized in perfect rows that seemed to have no end. His guard, a young American corporal with a rifle slung casually over his shoulder, noticed Joe staring. "This," the guard said through a translator, "this is just one warehouse. We got 47 more just like it." Joe's legs buckled. He caught himself against the doorframe. For 6 months, his commanders had told him that America was on the verge of collapse, that their supplies were running out, that victory was inevitable. But standing in front of this cathedral of abundance, Joe understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. China had sent him to fight a war it could never win. If you're watching from China, America, Korea, or anywhere across the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Stories like this, raw, human, and forgotten, deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. These stories matter because they show us that truth, no matter how painful, always finds a way to surface. The Korean War began in June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Within months, American-led UN forces pushed the North Koreans back, advancing all the way to the Chinese border. Chairman Mao Zedong could not allow this. A unified Korea under American influence was unacceptable. In October 1950, he made the decision to intervene. The order was clear: send soldiers, hundreds of thousands of them, push the Americans back, win through sheer numbers and revolutionary spirit. Private Zhou Wei was among those called to service. He was 21 years old, a farmer's son from Sichuan province. He had joined the Communist Youth League at 17, attended political education classes, memorized Mao's writings. He believed in the revolution. He believed in the party. He believed that China was building a new world. And he believed what the commissars told him about America. The propaganda was relentless and consistent. America, they said, was a dying empire. Its economy was collapsing. Its workers were exploited. Its soldiers were poorly trained and poorly equipped. Its people were weak, obsessed with luxury, incapable of sacrifice. The Americans, one commissar told Joe's battalion, fight only when they think they can win easily. When they face real resistance, they retreat. They are paper tigers, fierce in appearance, but hollow inside. Joe had no reason to doubt this. He had never left China. He had never seen the outside world. Everything he knew about America came from party-approved sources. And those sources painted a picture of an enemy that was already defeated, just too stubborn to admit it. In October 1951, Joe's unit crossed the Yalu River into North Korea. The journey was brutal. They marched at night to avoid American airstrikes. During the day, they hid in forests and caves, shivering under thin quilted uniforms. Food was scarce. Each soldier received a daily ration of millet grain, sometimes supplemented with dried vegetables or salted fish. On good days, there was enough to fill the stomach. On bad days, there was just enough to keep moving. Joe's boots were cloth, not leather. His rifle was a Soviet-made Mosin Nagant, decades old, prone to jamming in the cold. His winter gear consisted of a padded jacket and a wool cap. In sub-zero temperatures, men froze to death in their sleep. But the commissars kept repeating the message. The Americans have it worse. They are far from home. Their supply lines are stretched thin. They cannot sustain this war. Victory is inevitable. Zhou believed it. He had to believe it, because the alternative, that they were suffering for nothing, was unbearable. The first time Zhou saw an American soldier up close was in late October. His unit had been ambushed near the Chosin Reservoir. The firefight was brief and chaotic. When it ended, Zhou's platoon was surrounded. An American Marine, no older than Zhou himself, motioned for them to drop their weapons. Zhou complied. He expected to be shot on the spot. Instead, the Marine checked him for injuries, gave him water, and handed him a cigarette. Zhou stared at the cigarette like it was a trick. Why would the enemy waste resources on a prisoner? As they were marched toward the rear lines, Zhou studied the Americans. Their uniforms were thick, insulated, designed for winter. Their boots were leather, waterproof. They carried rifles that looked new, clean, functional, and they moved with a casualness that disturbed him. They weren't desperate. They weren't starving. They weren't afraid. One Marine was eating a chocolate bar as he walked. Zhou watched him take a bite, chew slowly, and then offer a piece to another prisoner. The gesture was so surreal that Zhou didn't know how to react. That night, Zhou and 42 other Chinese prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven south to a POW camp on Kojedo Island, off the southern coast of Korea. The journey took 3 days. They were fed twice daily: rice, canned vegetables, even some meat. The portions were modest, but they were consistent. Zhou kept waiting for the trap. Surely this was a tactic. Fatten them up before the interrogation. Make them weak with comfort before the torture. But the torture never came. When they arrived at Kojedo, the camp was already holding thousands of prisoners, North Koreans, Chinese, even some Soviet advisors. The compound was massive, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but inside it looked almost orderly. Barracks made of wood and corrugated metal. Latrines that were cleaned daily. A medical clinic staffed by American medics and Korean interpreters. A mess hall that served 3 meals a day. Zhou was processed like a bureaucrat in a government office. Name, rank, unit, medical check, delousing, assignment to Barracks 14. It was all so normal. That first night, lying on a cot with a blanket that didn't smell like mildew, Zhou whispered to the man beside him, Sergeant Li Huang, a veteran of the Civil War, "When does the interrogation start?" Li shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow came and went, and the day after that, and the day after that. There were no interrogations, no beatings, no forced confessions. Instead, there were work assignments. On his 4th day at Kojedo, Zhou was selected for a labor detail. He and 12 other prisoners were taken to the docks, where American supply ships were being unloaded. That's when Zhou saw the warehouse. It stood at the edge of the port, a concrete structure the size of a football field. The doors were open, and forklifts moved in and out, carrying pallets loaded with crates. The American corporal leading the work detail gestured toward the building. "You'll be helping unload shipments," the translator explained. "Don't try anything stupid. There's guards everywhere." Zhou nodded, barely listening. He was staring at the warehouse, trying to process what he was seeing. The sheer scale of it was incomprehensible. As they walked inside, Zhou felt his breath catch. The ceiling soared above him, supported by steel beams. The floor was smooth concrete, painted with yellow lines marking pathways. And everywhere, were supplies. Crates of canned food stacked 12 feet high. Sacks of flour piled in mountains. Drums of cooking oil lined up in rows. medical supplies in white boxes marked with red crosses, clothing, thousands of uniforms, all identical, all new. A forklift drove past, carrying a pallet of canned peaches. The driver was whistling. Zhou stood frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The corporal noticed. Something wrong? The translator repeated the question in Mandarin. Zhou finally found his voice. How much is here? The corporal shrugged. This warehouse? Maybe 2 weeks' worth of supplies for one division. Zhou's mind raced. 1 division. 2 weeks. He looked around again, trying to estimate. Thousands of tons. Tens of thousands of individual items. How many warehouses are there? The corporal grinned. On this island? 47. Across Korea? Couple hundred, I'd guess. Zhou felt the ground tilt. 47 warehouses. Just on this island. The translator saw Zhou's expression and added quietly, "The Americans bring in supply ships every day, sometimes 2 or 3 at once." Zhou's legs gave out. He sat down hard on a crate, hands trembling. For 6 months, he had been told that America was running out of supplies, that their logistics were failing, that their war effort was unsustainable. But here, in front of him, was proof of the opposite. Not just abundance, not just surplus, infinite abundance. That night, back in the barracks, Zhou couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying what he had seen. Sergeant Li asked, "What's wrong?" Zhou spoke quietly, aware that others might be listening. "The warehouse. Did you see it?" Li nodded. "I saw. They have 47 of them, just here, just on this island." Li didn't respond. "How do we win against that?" Zhou whispered. Li turned away. "We don't talk about winning anymore. We talk about surviving." But Zhou couldn't let it go. The math was too brutal, too unavoidable. If America could supply 1 division for 2 weeks with 1 warehouse, and they had 47 warehouses just on Kojedo, that meant they could sustain, what, 20 divisions? 30? And the corporal had said there were hundreds of warehouses across Korea. Meanwhile, Chinese soldiers were eating millet and freezing in cloth boots. The disparity wasn't just significant, it was existential. Over the following weeks, Zhou's work detail continued. Every day he unloaded ships. Every day he saw more. Trucks, jeeps, ambulances, all in perfect working order. Spare parts stacked in crates. Tires, hundreds of them, brand new. Gasoline drums marked U.S. Army in stenciled letters. One day, a shipment of refrigerated containers arrived. Zhou watched as American soldiers unloaded frozen meat, beef, pork, chicken. The translator explained, "For Thanksgiving dinner. It's an American holiday." Zhou couldn't speak. In China, meat was a luxury reserved for party officials and special occasions. Here, it was holiday food for ordinary soldiers. Another day, a crate fell and broke open. Inside, chocolate bars, thousands of them. An American sergeant cursed, then shrugged. "Happens. We'll requisition more." Zhou stared at the spilled chocolate. In his village, sugar was rationed. Children went years without tasting sweets. Here, chocolate was so plentiful that a broken crate didn't matter. He picked up one of the bars. "Hershey's," the wrapper said. He turned it over in his hands, then slipped it into his pocket. That night, he unwrapped it slowly and took a bite. The sweetness overwhelmed him. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he wasn't a prisoner of war. He was just a man tasting something impossibly rich. Then the guilt hit. His comrades were still fighting, still starving, still dying, and he was eating American chocolate. Among the Chinese prisoners, a divide began to form. Others, like Private Chen Bo, clung to ideology. This is a trick. They want us to forget the revolution. They want us to betray Chairman Mao. Chen organized study groups in the barracks, reciting Mao's writings, reminding prisoners of their duty to the party. Zhou attended a few times, but his heart wasn't in it. The words felt hollow now, empty slogans in the face of overwhelming evidence. One evening, Chen confronted him. "You've changed, Zhou. You used to believe." Zhou looked at him. "I still believe, but I also have eyes." "What does that mean?" Zhou gestured toward the window, toward the docks. "It means I've seen their warehouses." Chen's face hardened. "So you're giving up? You're letting the imperialists win?" Zhou shook his head. "They've already won. They won before the war even started." Chen struck him, a sharp slap across the face. "Traitor," Chen hissed. Zhou didn't fight back. He just touched his cheek and walked away. That night, he lay on his cot and thought about home. His parents working the fields, his younger sister learning to read in a village school, his grandfather who had fought the Japanese, who had believed in the Communist Party, who had died thinking the revolution would bring prosperity. Zhou wondered what his grandfather would think if he could see this camp, if he could see the warehouses, if he could do the math. Would he still believe? In January 1952, the camp received a visit from Red Cross inspectors. Zhou watched as they toured the facilities, took notes, interviewed prisoners. One inspector, a Swiss man with a kind face, asked Zhou through a translator, "How are you being treated?" Zhou hesitated. The truth was complicated. "We are fed," he said finally. "We are not beaten. We are given medical care." The inspector nodded. "That is good. Is there anything you need?" Zhou thought about the question. What did he need? Not food, not shelter, not safety. What he needed was an explanation. An explanation for why everything he had been told was a lie. But he couldn't say that, so he just shook his head. The inspector moved on. By spring, Zhou had been at Koyedo for 6 months. The work continued. The meals continued. The strange, disorienting normally continued. One day, a new shipment arrived. This one was different. Crates marked Korea Relief, Civilian Aid. Zhou helped unload them. Inside, blankets, rice, cooking oil, medical supplies. But these weren't for the military. They were for Korean civilians displaced by the war. The American sergeant supervising the operation explained, "We're rebuilding schools, hospitals, roads. Gotta win hearts and minds, you know?" Zhou didn't understand the phrase, but he understood the implication. America wasn't just fighting a war, it was rebuilding a country. At the same time, the scale of it was incomprehensible. China couldn't feed its own soldiers. America was feeding enemy civilians. That night, Zhou made a decision. He would write a letter home. The Americans allowed it. Prisoners could send mail, though it was censored. He wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read every word. "Dear Mother and Father, I am alive and well. The food here is adequate. I am learning much. Please tell Grandfather's spirit that I am thinking of him. I hope the harvest is good this year. Your son, Zhou Wei." He didn't mention the warehouses. He didn't mention the chocolate. He didn't mention the cognitive dissonance tearing him apart. But he hoped, somehow, that his parents would read between the lines. In July 1953, the armistice was signed. The Korean War ended, not with victory, but with a ceasefire. Prisoners were given a choice: return to China or defect to Taiwan. Zhou faced the hardest decision of his life. If he returned to China, he would face interrogation, suspicion. Any prisoner who had seen too much, learned too much, thought too much was a liability. But if he defected, he would never see his family again. He thought about the warehouses. He thought about the chocolate. He thought about the lie he had lived inside for 21 years. And he thought about his grandfather, who had believed in something that turned out to be a beautiful, tragic illusion. In the end, Zhou chose to return, not because he believed in the party, but because he couldn't abandon his family. The journey back was long and silent. Hundreds of former prisoners, packed into trains and trucks, heading north across the border. When they crossed into China, officials were waiting. The repatriation process was immediate and harsh. "Why did you surrender?" they asked. "What did you tell the Americans? Do you still believe in Chairman Mao?" Zhou answered carefully. He said what they wanted to hear. He recited slogans. He denounced imperialism. But in his pocket, wrapped in cloth, he carried a single Hershey's bar. He had saved it, hidden it, brought it home, not because he loved America, but because he needed proof. Proof that what he had seen was real. Zhou was sent to a re-education camp in the countryside. Not a prison, officially, just a place where former POWs could reintegrate into socialist society. He spent 2 years there, working in fields, attending political lectures, confessing his ideological weaknesses. He never mentioned the warehouses. In 1955, he was released. He returned to his village, to his parents, to his sister. They had aged. The years had been hard. The great leap forward was beginning, and food shortages were already appearing. One night, his father asked quietly, "What was it like? In the camp?" Zhou thought for a long time before answering. "They had more food than they knew what to do with," he said finally. His father frowned. "That can't be true. The party says they are suffering." Zhou nodded. "Yes, that's what the party says." He left it at that. Years later, during the Cultural Revolution, Zhou was investigated for his time as a POW. His sister was questioned. His parents were denounced. But Zhou survived. He kept his head down. He worked. He stayed silent. And every night, he remembered the warehouses. In the 1980s, after Mao's death, after Deng Xiaoping's reforms, after China began opening to the world, Zhou was interviewed by a historian researching the Korean War. The historian asked, "What was the most shocking thing you saw as a prisoner?" Zhou thought about the question. He thought about the chocolate, the frozen meat, the casual abundance. Then he said, "I saw 47 warehouses full of supplies, and I realized that we never had a chance. Not because we weren't brave, but because we were fighting a country that could waste more than we could produce." The historian wrote that down. "Do you regret fighting?" he asked. Zhou shook his head. "I regret that we were lied to. We were told we were fighting for a better world, but we were just fighting for a lie." The historian paused. "Do you still believe in the revolution?" Zhou looked out the window. Decades had passed. China had changed. The world had changed. "I believe in what I saw," he said quietly. "And what I saw was 47 warehouses on a small island. Everything else is just talk." Private Zhou Wei died in 2003 at the age of 73. His family buried him in his village next to his grandfather. In his personal belongings, they found a faded Hershey's wrapper, pressed flat and preserved between the pages of a notebook. No one knew why he had kept it, but Zhou had known. It was proof. Proof that the world was bigger than he had been told. Proof that abundance existed, even if he would never fully taste it. Proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is not a bomb, but a warehouse full of canned peaches. And that truth, once seen, can never be unseen. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold accounts from the Korean War and beyond. History like this deserves to be told, shared, and never forgotten. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. These voices from the past still speak, and they always will.